When people talk about Palestinians, one of the things that comes up is, where is their Martin Luther King? Where is their peaceful person who will come and deliver them from violence and prepare them for, the modern world? That's the wrong question. That's the wrong framing. And frankly, that's the wrong interpretation of Dr. Martin Luther King. We like to think about Martin Luther King as the patron saint of nonviolence. We like to talk about Martin Luther King as the person who told Black people to not fight back with fists, to not use knives and guns. The person who led a movement toward nonviolence, who staged spectacles of nonviolence, like on the Edmund Pettus Bridge, where Black people's nonviolent response to the brutal violence of Bull Connor, the brutal violence of the state, the brutal violence of the South, created a kind of public sympathy that allowed for a shift in public sentiment and maybe even a shift in public policy ultimately. And so the idea is, well, why aren't Palestinians being more like Martin Luther King? Why aren't they following the example and the tradition of Martin Luther King? Well, there's a few things to be said about that. One, Martin Luther King Jr. is one of many traditions, and nonviolence and nonviolent resistance is an important part of any freedom struggle. I don't think the first thing you begin with is violence. And when you look at the Palestinian response historically, they've never begun with violence. Palestinians never started with violence. There have been nonviolent resistance efforts since the first moment that Zionist settlers appeared in historic Palestine. There have been nonviolent protests. There have been nonviolent boycotts. There have been general strikes, like the general strike of 1936, April of 1936 to October of 1936. There have been BDS movements, the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement that's happening right now. There have been the Great March of Return events, like the one we saw a few years ago in Gaza. There are all of these moments where Palestinians have used nonviolence as a method to freedom. The first Intifada, the first major uprising in 1987, ends in 91, some would argue 93 at the beginning of the Oslo Accords. But when it happens, my point is, Palestinians said, okay, we'll have a diplomatic response. We'll try to work this thing out. We'll work toward a two-state solution. And even when Palestinians are nonviolent, settler colonialism continues, settlement expansion continues, violence continues. It's not as if Palestinians come out swinging and Israel is forced to defend itself. The very presence of an illegal occupation, the very presence of a siege in Gaza, the very presence of illegal settlements is an act of violence. Let me be very clear. You can respond to these acts of violence with resistance, with violent resistance, yes. Doesn't mean that your legal freedoms and rights are unlimited, though, right? Doesn't mean you can kill civilians. It doesn't mean that you can bomb hospitals. It doesn't mean that you can harm children. Right? This is part of what it means to follow international law and rules of war as well. So I'm not saying that anything goes. However, Palestinians are resisting because they are being met with violence. And Dr. King believed as a moral project. Dr. King believed as a moral issue that nonviolence was the most humanizing way to function. Dr. King believed that nonviolence would allow us as the nonviolent resistors to hold on to our own moral center, right? I'm not going to allow your actions to change who I am. I'm not going to allow you to be what I am. Or rather, I'm not going to allow myself to be what you are. Dr. King also owned a gun. Dr. King never suggested that we should allow ourselves to be killed by our open enemies. Dr. King never said, if somebody's beating you to death, just let them beat you to death. Nonviolence was a philosophy for him, but it was also a tactic and a strategy. But what do you do against a violent state? How do you respond to a violent state, to a state that is committed to your erasure, to your elimination? In the United States, white folk, a white supremacist state was committed to exploiting our labor, to manipulating our labor, to extracting value from us. That's what racial capitalism does. But the ultimate goal for Black folk in this country was to get free, to get equality against a state that was trying to keep them as a second-class citizen. The goal of settler colonialism in historic Palestine has been to remove Palestinians from the land, to uproot them, to transfer them, to kill them, to dismantle all of their structures and artifacts and histories and infrastructures that made home home. That's what settler colonialism does. So the Palestinian Dr. King doesn't sort of emerge in the way you want, because he can't emerge in the way that you want. Also, when the Dr. King of Palestine does emerge, when there's a chance at nonviolence, the Israeli state still refuses to offer a reasonable two-state solution. They've refused to offer contiguous land, to offer a massive land, they've access to water. Many of the things that we've seen from the first partition plan of 1947 by the United Nations up until the Clinton Accords have been really bad attempts to create a final status for Palestine, in the sense that they don't give Palestinians what they need or what they deserve. But let's also talk about Dr. King in a different way, because there's also a narrative here that Dr. King himself was a Zionist, that Dr. King himself wanted the conditions in Israel and Palestine to be what they were, and that he stood firmly on the side of the state of Israel. That is simply untrue. That is simply untrue. Here's what is true. Throughout history, many Black freedom fighters, many Black nationalists in particular, believed in the Zionist project. They believed that the formation of the state of Israel represented the possibility of victory over white supremacy, victory over oppressors, that a nation could be formed of people of the same sort, and that they could create their own nation state and achieve liberation. That's why Marcus Garvey saw this idea of Zionism, particularly that early wave of 19th century, late 19th century, early 20th century Zionism, as a potential victory. That's why W.E.B. Du Bois says, that's why W.E.B. Du Bois writes an article called Ethics and the Problem of Palestine, which you can find in the archives at, I believe, the University of Massachusetts, Amherst. And it becomes an article or an op-ed in the Chicago Star called A Case for the Jews. And in it, Du Bois also makes the case that Israel is a righteous project, that Israel is providing safety for Jews who need it, that Israel, that the Jews, the Zionists, were filling up a barren land, that the Arabs who were there were Mohammedans, right? So there's a way that Du Bois is framing the Arab as a kind of exotic figure and an uncivilized figure, and that the Zionist movement, that the Jewish nationalist movement was going to civilize these people. This is what Du Bois is arguing. So there's a long tradition, very true, of Black freedom fighters, of Black thinkers, of Black radicals even, who identified with the Zionist project. But the question is why? Well, at that stage, they truly believed that in historic Palestine, we see the formation of a binational state in line with the Balfour Declaration of 1917. They really believed that the civil and religious rights of Palestinians would not be compromised by them coming. They sincerely believed that what they were doing was correct. Now, here in the United States, there was also a very powerful and strong, and still is, right, relationship between the civil rights movement, between Black progressive activists and Jewish organizations, Jewish activists, Jewish citizens, right, Jewish comrades. We hear about, Schwarmer, Goodman, and Cheney. That's not an exception, right? There's a very strong alliance between Black people and Jewish people in the United States. And increasingly, through the 20th century, the state of Israel and the status of Israel became one of the defining political issues in America for Jewish Americans and for Jews around the globe, as it should, right? Why is this relevant? Well, because there's a shift that happens, right? Black folk, we got wiser and smarter about these issues, as everybody did. When you think about Ralph Bunche, who he got a Nobel Peace Prize for, helped attempt to broker peace between what he would say is the Arabs and the Jews. We began to see a pivot. People like George Schuler enter the picture. You begin to see a pivot after the 1967 war. Why? Well, because people watched the violence of the 1967 war. They watched Israel occupy the Sinai and occupy Gaza and occupy the Golan Heights. They watched a radical shift in what was happening in the world, and they started to say, wait a minute, this is starting to look like colonialism. So now not only do you have people like Malcolm X speaking up, and Malcolm X absolutely spoke up. He wrote an essay in the Egyptian Gazette in the fall of 1964 called Zionist Logic, where he talked about the Zionist movement as camouflage, as coming in a kind of camouflage toward the continent of Africa. He wasn't exceptionalizing Israel. He wasn't saying Israel was doing something different than other nations. His point was Israel was doing exactly what other nations do, and that we shouldn't think of Israel as any different than the other nations that were operating through colonial strategy, of camouflage, of what he called the new dollarism, of economic sort of offering economic incentives to different vulnerable nations, right? Again, it would be problematic if he were to hold Israel to a different standard. But what he was saying was, no, Israel should be held to the same standard. This project is just as troublesome as the 20th century, 19th century projects were, political projects. You got SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, after the 1967 war, publishing a newsletter criticizing Israel for its colonial occupation, right? So you begin to see a shift. And even Dr. King, to the day he died, just to tie back to Dr. King absolutely had critiques of Israel. There were a group of ministers who signed a letter and a statement that was going on the New York Times. King suddenly didn't want to be a part of it. King said that Israel had grown, to use his language, King's language, smug. So King had a kind of appreciation for the 1948 project, saying, look, Jews are unsafe. I think we all agree with that. Jews are unsafe, and throughout the entire modern history of the world, we could say Jews have been unsafe, right? Particularly as minorities around the globe. And after the pogroms in Russia and in Poland in the 1800s, after Hitler rose to power, after the evils of the Nazi Holocaust, there was a definite need for Jews to be safe and free, for Jews to have freedom and dignity and safety and self-determination. No one disagreed with that. The question was, could this happen without, to use the language of the Balfour Declaration in 1917, without violating the civil and religious rights of the people who were already there? And King was starting to realize that they couldn't. King was reluctant to go to Jerusalem now that Jerusalem had been occupied by Israel. It had already been occupied by Jordan, but now it was being occupied by Israel. The concern of King was that Israel would occupy East Jerusalem and not give it back. Well, guess what? King had that concern in 1967. King died in 1968. They still ain't gave it back yet. East Jerusalem is still under Israeli occupation. Still under Israeli occupation. So yeah, my phone's on the charger, y'all. I learned my lesson earlier. So why is this relevant? Well, it's relevant because Dr. King dies before he can fully articulate his position on Israel or allow for his position on Israel to shift or to be fully realized as it does shift. But Dr. King, even at the moment he died, again, expressed concerns with the Israeli state. He expressed concerns with the capture of Jerusalem. But even if we get beyond that, Dr. King's fundamental principles, when y'all come to me with the what would Dr. King do or why can't Palestine find a Dr. King was against militarism. Dr. King was against labor exploitation. Dr. King talked about the triplet of misery: racism, poverty, and militarism. Okay? If Dr. King were alive today, he would see the clear racism that exists within the Israeli state. He would see the fact that Israel is not a democracy. It is an ethnocracy that provides different values, different resources, different statuses, different forms of citizenship, different rights to people based on their racial or ethnic or national identity. That is racism. Israel has been declared by 18 human rights organizations to be what? An apartheid state. You can't be an apartheid state and be anti-racist at the same time. So King would have been against the racism. King was against poverty and economic exploitation. In Israel right now, if you look in Gaza before the awful incidences, and before the awful incidents that occurred on October 7th and since, people in Gaza lived in mass poverty, extraordinary poverty. You're talking about wealth inequality. Look at the unemployment rate in Gaza. Look at people who didn't have potable water before the most recent quote unquote war. Look at the people who didn't have access to food, clothing, and shelter. Look at the people who didn't have access to full nutrition. This is Gaza right now. And Gaza's not singular. Go to the West Bank. Go to refugee camps. Refugee camps. You have people who were evicted from their homes in 1948 in cities like Jerusalem or in cities like Wadi al-Hawadith. And now they're in camps like Jenin or Tulkarem in the case of Wadi al-Hawadith. They're in these places. And the refugee camps are no longer just tents. They returned to concrete. And the concrete became permanent. People are refugees in their own home. Somebody said, you mean Zionists, not Jews? Choose your words. I'm not sure what we're talking about right now, but I've been talking about Zionists. But it's also important to understand that in Israel, your nationality is not Israeli. Your nationality isn't Zionist. Your nationality is Jewish. And part of what it means to be a Jewish state is that the Jewish character of the nation has to be preserved at all times. And so I absolutely agree that we have to distinguish Judaism from Zionism and Jews from Zionists. My critique isn't of Jews. To punish Jews for being Jews, or to criticize Jews for being Jews, or to offer discriminatory behavior against Jews for being Jews would be anti-Semitic. My critique is of the Israeli government, the same way I have critiques of the Saudi government, the same way I have critiques of the American government. I have critiques of the Israeli government, but not just the Israeli administration right now under Netanyahu, or the current organization of the Knesset right now. It's deeper than that. It's deeper than that, right? This is about saying that the state as it's constructed right now is not a state of all of its citizens. A bill came through, the nation state bill, which became the nation state law, which affirmed that Israel is not a state of all of its citizens. This is the challenge. Dr. King would say this is racism. Dr. King would say the poverty that we see in refugee camps, even inside the state of Israel, the disparate economic access and the economic stratification and inequality that we see inside of Israel between Ashkenazim and Beta Israel, or the Ethiopian Jews who migrated in or immigrated and made Aliyah. We see economic inequality. Now, let me be very clear. All nations have economic inequality, nearly. Certainly capitalist nations. So I don't think that we should criticize or demand more from Israel than we do from the United States or from France or from Germany or any of these other nations. The point here isn't to hold Israel to a different standard, but it is to say that Israel has to be also held to a standard. It can't be the sole target, but it also can't be the only thing that's not criticized. We have to criticize all of it. And Dr. King, finally, racism, poverty, and also militarism. What would Dr. King say about the Israeli response? If Dr. King believed in nonviolence, do you think right now Dr. King would be criticizing Palestinians, or would be criticizing the Israeli state for the extraordinary use of violence that's being waged against the Palestinian people in Gaza at this moment? Now, let's be clear. Would Dr. King have said Hamas had no right? Well, I don't know if he say right, but would Dr. King have disapproved of Hamas's behavior? Would he have denounced Hamas for throwing or for killing innocent Israelis? Absolutely. Absolutely. I share Dr. King's critique of Hamas on that point. I'm not asking Palestinians to reject Hamas. I'm not asking Palestinians to ritually denounce anybody. I think that is problematic for lots of reasons. But I can tell you personally that I have a disagreement with Hamas. But Dr. King would also say, as he often did, that the riot is the language of the unheard. That when people are put in unlivable circumstances, when people have their access to capital taken, when people are silenced by the state, when people are beaten and tortured and unlawfully detained or lawfully detained under a legal system that's not righteous. And again, I'm not just talking about Israel. I'm saying all modern nation states have legal systems that are not righteous. They're carceral. When that all happens, you can't be surprised when people respond. If you want to give people a context where they don't react violently, if you want people to be peaceful, cool. We all agree on that. Nobody wants the absence of peace. But justice has to precede peace. And as long as people don't have justice, we will not produce peace. So when we talk about Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and why Palestinians haven't embraced Dr. King, let's not be so sure that Dr. King would have a radically different analysis of what's going on in Palestine than a lot of us do today. And let's not presume that Dr. King, and in fact, I'm going to go a step further. Let's assume that Dr. King would not expect Palestinians to lay down and die in some bizarre allegiance to nonviolence when the state that's destroying them and killing them has a commitment to fulfilling and completing a settler colonial project that is founded on violence, advanced by violence, and finalized through violence. Dr. King would never ask people to just lay down and die. And again, I'm saying one more time, nonviolent resistance is possible. And Palestinians have engaged in nonviolent resistance, and they've been met with violence. At some point, it becomes common sense. It becomes necessary. It becomes natural. It becomes intuitive. It becomes instinctive. And it also is legal to resist. All resistance isn't legal. All resistance isn't moral. I'm going to say that again, so y'all don't take me out of context. But resistance is always necessary.